You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas. You sound awfully chipper for a Monday.
I try my hardest for you.
Whether you're actually feeling chipper or not, you're doing your damnedest impression of a chipper sounding person.
That is right. Yes. I've been working with my students performing the crucible all day long in class.
Well,
I may as well just go for broke with this voice and take all the vocal performances I did and just carry it over into right now.
Very Lauren Bacall. Crucible, that's heavy stuff.
Oh, I love the Crucible. And usually the kids seem to enjoy it too, because we're hitting on big morality issues. And then it always blows their mind right at the end when I tell them, but actually it's also about the House Un-American Activities Committee and the hunt for communists. And then that kind of blows their little minds a little bit.
And you hold off on that until the end.
Yes, I hold off on that until the end. And then we do a comparison between all the events in the Crucible and the actual events of the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Joe McCarthy hearings and all that.
And as you recall, my favorite question, and I always want to ask on our podcast is, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
And a lot of these kids, unfortunately, have to explain communism to them.
I know. And the thing is, that gets thrown around a lot these days as an insult. Most people seem to be confusing communism and socialism.
They always seem to enjoy it once I'm able to bring in the parallel thing and talk to them about Arthur Miller and how he was brought up in front of HUAC. And then I throw in that he was married to Marilyn Monroe, and that becomes the whole thing because I have to explain who Marilyn Monroe was. And at some point I just start feeling old.
Hey, come on. They don't know who Marilyn Monroe is?
Not a lot of them.
If you show the picture, did they say, oh, yeah, I kind of...
Not really. No. For reference, I was just talking to my film class and none of them knew who John Wayne was.
Wow, I am feeling old.
I know. It makes me feel old too.
They didn't know who John Wayne was?
No, I'm really having to start from scratch with a lot of my film classes and explain. Okay, I feel like I need to do flashcards. This is Cary Grant. This is Jimmy Stewart. This is John Wayne. But it's okay. I like doing that. I like educating about amazing film stars and directors and good movies and all of that. And I like doing the same with literature, which is why I'm still doing this job after 16 years.
I had a colleague, a coworker, who worked in our Los Angeles office at ASCAP, and I worked in the New York office. And she used to insist that I reminded her of Spencer Tracy, which she meant as a compliment, which I thought was awfully nice. But I'm sure if I mentioned Spencer Tracy to your students, they'd be like, who? What? Yeah.
And just when I hope that they would understand the reference with Katharine Hepburn, they don't know who Katharine Hepburn is either. But they're going to learn. We're doing Bringing Up Baby next week.
Great. So who would they know instead?
Not a lot, unfortunately. So that is the point of the evolution of cinema class. I am educating them. So now they do all know who Buster Keaton is, Charlie Chaplin, the Marx Brothers. Like, I'm educating them.
Yeah.
Slowly but surely.
Those are actually important people.
Yes, they are.
And comedy is a great way to introduce other themes.
Yep. And that is why we start there.
And in terms of their education, I'm very impressed. I would love to take your film class.
Honestly, I wonder if maybe that's something I should be trying to figure out how to put up online and monetize or something like that.
Absolutely. I am a major film buff, and one of the most enjoyable series of classes I took were film classes as an undergrad. We did one whole semester on film noir
We just did that. Yeah.
There's so much about classic film that I enjoy. I like new movies too. My biggest complaint is that I feel like the current studio and network system has destroyed motion picture as an art form.
I agree.
There's a lot of great television, but there aren't really very many great movies these days.
Yes, I agree. Sound off in the comments if you guys want Miss Dilley to turn her evolution of cinema class into something we can monetize and put up here as part of the podcast. Sound off, let me know.
But you could probably talk about movies. You're not going to be able to show them. But
yeah, unfortunately, we can figure out something.
If you want to do that without me, feel free, but I would do that with you as well. That would be fun.
I cannot do a podcast all on my own because you have all the equipment.
Oh, okay.
You have the Rodecaster. There is no way for me to record on my own.
I've locked you into this partnership.
Yes, that's it. There is no way I can ever venture off on my own because I do not own the equipment.
I have told many people, in addition to enjoying doing this true crime podcast with you, it also means we divvy up all the work so that it's only half as much work. There's a significant amount of effort that goes into creating a podcast, and it's great to have somebody to divvy up the tasks with. On a more serious note, shall we?
I was going to say, I think it's about time for the intro to be over and get into the actual meat. That was a longer intro than most, but fun.
Yeah, it was. So forgive us. We don't meander that much these days.
No, not normally, but it is, at the time of this recording, it is November the 13th, and we are 1 month out from a event that we were both very flattered and moved to be a part of, and that was the Keith Call Memorial that took place on October the 14th, so 1 month ago. That does mean it's been one whole entire month since we were last together in person, Mr. Thomas.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's long ago. This month has flown by.
I feel every month flies by now.
I was talking to someone today who said that she feels that once Halloween hits, they just feel like it's one major holiday after another.
Yep.
We've got Halloween and then Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's. And I know different people celebrate, whether it's Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or Diwali or other festival of light, Festivus for the rest of us, or their pagan rituals, which all seem to be around December 21st. These holidays seem to come hot and heavy as we head into the last part of the year.
They do. And so, yeah, it does not feel like it has been 4 weeks since we last saw each other, but it was. As I said before, honored and flattered to be part of this really lovely memorial service that was put together for Keith Call by his family and by the folks at the Cumberland Historic Cemetery Association. Can you explain a little bit about the Cumberland Historic Cemetery Organization?
The Cumberland Historic Cemetery Organization is based in Maryland, and it's run by a wonderful guy named Ed Taylor, Jr. He's the president. He is from Maryland, obviously from Cumberland, and they have been doing hundreds of monuments and dedications, primarily to historic figures. But you don't necessarily have to be a president or a general or whatever to be honored by the cemetery organization. They've made it their work to add stones where stones and markers would not have been placed. So as they learn about historic figures, and these can be everything from slaves to generals, a lot of soldiers on both the Union and Confederate side, they try to highlight people who have been not properly acknowledged in terms of their contributions. So they do a lot of things with historic cemeteries throughout Maryland. Mr. Taylor was aware of the Colonial Parkway murders, and he took the kind of unusual step a few months ago. This probably would have been last spring, would be my guess, because I heard about this from Joyce Call Canada, Keith's sister. Ed Taylor had reached out to her and said that he was interested in finding out if the Call family was willing to allow the cemetery organization to place a marker in his honor. And this led to a really interesting conversation which you and I participated in, which is when a person goes missing, like Keith Call and Cassandra Hailey have in the Colonial Parkway murders, there's usually never an event that marks that missing status. You are always hoping, I think, that the person will make their way back home somehow, that they've been lost or kidnapped. I mean, we've heard stories over the years. For the most part, missing people either return relatively quickly or they're gone for a long period of time. But in both examples, you're not marking their departure. Do you recall some of our conversations from the spring?
I do. I remember Joyce calling and saying, what are some of the things that we might like to do to mark this occasion? And we also spent some time together talking about what are the things that we can do. Do we want to have pictures up of Keith? Of course, absolutely. You want to have pictures up. We also talked about, do we want to have a memorial book that people can write in to mark the occasion and who all was there? And we had thought about that and we went back and forth on it a little bit. And ultimately that part of it didn't happen. But we were talking about how do we want to commemorate this? Who do we want to speak? I did not expect to speak. I was a little taken aback when Ed was like, we'd like you to speak. And I'm like, no, you don't, because as we all know, I am not a fan of public speaking. But we definitely spent a lot of time trying to figure out, what do we want this to look like? Both the ceremony, the before and the afterward. How do we all want to come together afterward and talk? And who do we want to have commemorate this along with all of us? I was really pleased overall with the array of people who showed up to speak and to commemorate Keith and his life and his memory. It ended up being a much more emotional event than I was anticipating it being, to be perfectly frank. I was not expecting to come away from it feeling like as emotionally wrung out as I was at the end of the day. I don't know if that's the same for you.
It was. I know one of the things we talked about when this idea first came up was, first of all, Joyce wanted to consult with her brothers to see if this was even something that they wanted to do. Ed had made the offer, which was a very kind and generous offer. They were, going to cover the cost of creating this beautiful stone, which would be almost like a grave mark, with the hope that this would be placed in the Call family's cemetery plot at the cemetery in Hayes, Virginia. So in the early going, Joyce needed to consult with her brothers. So she talked to her brothers, Chris, Doug, Stephen, and her aunt Lou Call.
Aunt Lou, yes.
Yeah, who's absolutely wonderful.
Aunt Lou.
Mr. and Mrs. Call, Richard Call and Barbara Call, Keith's parents and the parents to the 5 kids, they're both gone now. And they're actually both buried in this cemetery, Rosewell, in Hayes, Virginia. Part of the early discussion was amongst the Call family, and you and I were in an advisory passage.
Yeah.
This is certainly something they have to decide. Yeah. Are we going to accept Mr. Taylor's kind offer? And so they discussed it amongst themselves. Most of the family lives in Virginia. Chris lives down in Florida. So they talked about it, and then they circled back with us, and they said, we think we want to move forward. And then that then led to the discussion you're talking about, which is, what does this look like? And as we were talking about at the top of this conversation, when someone goes missing, there isn't an opportunity to have a memorial service or a funeral because of this hope that they'll come back. When it gets to be 35 years later and Keith and Sandy haven't come back, you begin to get to a place, and this is a hard place to be, which is more of an acceptance that it is not likely that Keith and Sandy are going to walk back through the door. They're lost to us forever. So you begin to think of this as a little bit more like a memorial service. And even then I had to probe a little bit because, again, this is up to the Call family. And keeping in mind that Keith and Sandy were on a first date, it's not like this would be a joint ceremony or anything like that. Mr. Taylor actually has extended an offer to the Hailey family as well if they would like to do something in the future, which is, again, very kind. I asked, is there a religious component to this thing? Like, what does a memorial service, which is what we began talking about, this, or a dedication of the stone, what does that look like? And what does that feel like? Now, in the end, this ended up feeling quite a bit like a funeral or a memorial service to me.
It did.
We were at a gravesite, literally standing on Mr. and Mrs. Call's graves when we spoke on this incredibly rainy,
oh man, it was
horrible day. The skies kind of just opened up on us. It was an interesting but emotionally very moving experience. I think because the unanswered questions still remain. Here it is now 35 years later.
One of the things that kind of needed to be balanced out, and this is something that Joyce and Chris and Doug and I and you had all talked about, is how much do we want to bring up the other cases in this particular series? In other words, do we treat Keith and Sandra's disappearance as this is an event that we recognize happened and we would like to talk just about Keith and Sandra, or do we fold in the others as well? When you and I sat down to write our remarks, we did this separately. I know you and I wanted to figure out, like, are we on the same page in terms of message? And part of that message was, how much guff do we want to give the FBI? And the answer ended up being not too terribly much.
Again, not my call.
I know, not either of our calls, but
we had to defer to the Call family.
But we also needed to figure out, how do we approach the rest of this? Do we also bring in Kathy and Becky, David and Robin, and Anna Maria and Daniel, or do we keep them separate? We ended up having additional speakers other than us who did bring in all aspects of the case. And so it did feel in a lot of ways that not only were we memorializing Keith, we were also in a way memorializing all of the other people who were lost to this series of cases as well.
One of the things that came out of the discussions, particularly with Joyce, and Joyce is the oldest sister. Joyce is the spokesperson for the Call family. And one of the things that came out of our conversations with Joyce, who's absolutely wonderful, is she said, we think we want to do this in the fall. And then she got more specific as the plans began to come together. She said, I would like to do this close to the date that Kathy and Becky went missing. And this was very deliberate on her part. And then she started to tell me, and I think us, you participated in some face-to-face discussions in Virginia that I wasn't there for. Keith's passing, which obviously this memorial service, this dedication of the stone marks, Joyce didn't want to let the opportunity go by, and she said this directly. I don't want to let the opportunity go by to fail to acknowledge all of the victims in the Colonial Parkway murders, and they actually included Brian Pettinger and Lori Ann Powell. So Joyce said, I want you to talk about all of the victims. And so I said something in my remarks about the Call family has asked me to help put Keith's disappearance and this loss in context with what was going on back then. So we have a celebration of Keith's life and an acknowledgement of the loss. But at the same time, Joyce is saying, we're not letting the opportunity go by to not continue to put pressure on the FBI and the Virginia State Police to put resources into these cases. And she said, I'm sorry, we're not just going to celebrate Keith and do nothing further. We'd be missing a phenomenal opportunity to keep putting pressure on law enforcement. Hence some of our remarks. I actually noticed there was a theme there.
Yes.
The families talked about Keith. You and I can't really talk about Keith because we didn't meet Keith.
Yeah.
The guests, if you will, that is people whose last name isn't Call, we mostly spoke about the larger picture.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the privilege of having known Keith in this life. We talked about the larger loss of all of the victims in the Colonial Parkway murders and how Keith and Sandra's disappearance fits into that overall puzzle.
one of the discussions, I went out to Joyce's house one afternoon after school for a sit-down discussion with her and one of her brothers. We sat down and we tried to figure out, okay, if we want to put this in context of all of the different cases, and we do, and we want this to be a call for renewed resources and energy and attention and all of those things that we want, who do we want to invite to this? And we sat down and we created an invitation list. This is all the people that we want to come. And we had every intention in the world of putting together a master list of everybody in law enforcement, state and federal government that we could think of that we could invite to this event. And we did. We came up with a massive list. I went home and found mail-in addresses for every single person on that list. And then Ed Taylor made sure that an invitation about this event was sent to every single person on that list. And that list went from the governor, lieutenant governor, the attorney general, like everybody that you could think of in state, local, federal government, you name it, anybody who would have heard of the case. We sent one to the current sheriff, to the former sheriff. We sent a ton of invitations out, not just to government officials and law enforcement, but also to the media. We made sure there was no stone unturned because we wanted this to be an opportunity for there to be media coverage of this case and to make sure that people are still aware this has not been solved. There is still much work that needs to be done, and we still need the focus to be on what can we do to solve these cases. The unfortunate part, I think, at the event of being up under the tent was I couldn't see the rest of the crowd, so I don't know how many people did or did not make it. I certainly figure we would have heard if the governor was there. I'm pretty sure he didn't make it. But I was curious how many people from our master list of we would like to show up. I'm wondering if any of them actually did show, because I have no way of knowing.
There were representatives there from various political offices. Mostly, I think in a situation like that, you're looking to create awareness. Their physical presence wasn't as critical as letting them know that this case goes on, that they're having a memorial service for Keith Call on October 14th. There were staff there, and there was media there. It wasn't as large a crowd as I had hoped for, but the weather was the worst I've ever seen.
It was so bad.
Cold and driving rain.
It was terrible.
It was horrible, just absolutely dreadful. Even under the big blue tent, which was spread out to give the family a place to sit out of the rain. I'm putting air quotes around that because that tent was leaking like a sieve. There was just so much rain coming down.
Oh my God, it was awful.
And there were probably 50 or 75 people there, all with umbrellas surrounding the blue tent, but we couldn't all fit underneath it. And they were just trying to stay warm and dry. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder. People told me outside the tent, I did leave at one point and walk around while the ceremony was still going on because I was looking for someone. Being outside the tent with all of the umbrellas, it made it hard to hear.
Yeah, now, that it did.
We were using a PA system with that many people crowded into this confined space. And then all the umbrellas, which were doing their best to fend off the rain, they were also causing the sound to be somewhat muffled. So it was less than ideal in terms of conditions, but we'd made a decision. Joyce, again, it was her call to decide, are we still going to do this thing graveside or not? And she decided, yes, we were going to do that. The weather did not cooperate.
No, it really didn't. It really didn't. Which is also part of the reason why we are doing this episode today is we want to make sure that everyone who was not able to be there or who wanted to be, but for various reasons could not be, you're in a different state, you're in a different country or whatever else. We wanted to give you the opportunity to hear our remarks, which we are going to share with you shortly. I definitely left that service and then the get together at Abington Church afterward, feeling like a wet, wrung out sponge. And it wasn't just because it had been raining. It was pretty emotional. And I had not anticipated it being that emotional. Because as you'd said before, I didn't know Keith. By the time Keith and Sandra disappeared, it was 88. I was 7 years old. I had no way of knowing Keith. My dad knew the Call family, so there is that connection there. I have no way of being emotionally connected other than through this case. But I still found it very, very moving and rather sad. I tried to hold it together best I could. It was a very moving and emotionally strenuous day.
I found it to be the same, and I encountered more of an emotional response in myself than I had anticipated as well. I think we're all so invested in seeing the Colonial Parkway murders solved, and the Call family has been so steadfast and has worked so hard to see this mystery through, and we're talking about over 35 years. They've done amazing work. Advocacy and creating a nonprofit organization to help their family and other families of missing and murdered people in Virginia be properly acknowledged. They've testified before the State House, and they have worked incredibly hard in the media and behind the scenes to try to keep this case moving forward. I look to them as this amazing beacon of hope. Yeah. And it was just incredibly difficult to look at this line of people sitting there dressed up in the front row as the rain just came pouring down and the community came out to show its support. And it was very sad. It's just incredibly difficult to look out at the Call family and all of their family and friends gathered around to acknowledge Keith's passing in this way. On some level, you could argue it's overdue, but I don't know when the right time is to shift your thinking from my brother is missing to my brother's never coming back. That's a very difficult transition to live through. But I found it really difficult as well. I actually thought you held it together better than I did.
It was hard. Part of the difficulty for me was also knowing how much you were struggling that day, too, because you don't normally. It's a little bit of inside baseball here for our listeners. Bill is one of the most cool, composed, keep it together people I think I've ever met. There have been times when I have seen interviewers try to get a rise out of him or get an emotional reaction out of him in ways that I don't appreciate, because that's clearly what they're going for. Yeah. Don't do that. That's not cool.
Yeah, but a lot of them do it. And actually, I've done so many of these, I can hear it coming. They do it for the local news. They do it for the national programs. It's unfortunate. I don't know why they feel they want to see the family break down. It's beyond me. I think what they're getting at is they're trying to convey the pain of the loss. Yeah. I don't think it's necessary, and I resist it. But it's difficult. I've choked up any number of times because I have certain hot spots, certain hot buttons that mostly center around my family and my parents, who are both gone now, their reaction to losing my sister. And I can imagine the Call family, and I never met Mr. and Mrs. Call, probably went through something very similar. And certainly we've gotten to know members of the Call family, the siblings and their Aunt Lou, quite well over the years. And I think their experience was similar.
I was also really gratified and moved to see, and I didn't notice it when we were at the graveside service, but I certainly saw a number of people as we proceeded over to the church to do a little reception. I was really moved at the number of family members of other victims who came to express their love and support. And that, more than anything else, I think, was what choked me up at times, too. Mm-hmm. I know that I did not expect to see some of the people there that I saw. I'm thrilled that they were there. I was so glad to see them, but I didn't expect it. And there were times when it was like, oh, man, this is wow, because it speaks to the bond that all of these families have together. You have been asked to join the club that nobody wanted to, and this club in particular, these 8 families. Here, all of these people showed up for it. That was very moving and touching.
Keith Call Memorial Remarks, October 14th, 2023. Good afternoon. My name is Bill Thomas. Some of you may know me as the older brother of Kathy Thomas, who together with her girlfriend Rebecca Dowski were the first two victims in the still unsolved Colonial Parkway murders. Others may know me from the Mind Over Murder True Crime podcast, which I co-host with Kristin Dilley. I want to thank all of you for being here today, a day to celebrate Keith Call, his life and his memory. I was not lucky enough to meet Keith during his short time here. That club, the Friends of Keith Call, is a very exclusive one that is no longer accepting members, I am sad to say. Yet I feel that I know Keith through the love of his family and friends, the people that knew him well and admired him the most. It might sound odd, but I actually find Keith to be an inspiring figure in my own life, whether it is his love of family, of fun, of computers, or even the rock band U2. There is much to be admired about Keith's impact in his all too short life. And always there is something about Keith that just makes me smile. In speaking with you today, the Call family asked me to place Keith's loss in context, which leads me to the Colonial Parkway murders. Keith and his friend Sandy disappeared in April 1988, and their loss is considered to be part of the Colonial Parkway murders. Now, this is a club that not one of us wanted to be asked to join. It can be a very hard place to be. The worst part about losing Keith and Sandy is the waiting. I can tell you that it's hard to lose one's daughter, son, sister, or brother and wait 35 years for answers. Just ask the Call and Hailey family. It's hard for the family of Robin Edwards and David Knobling to wait 36 years for answers. It's hard for the family of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer to wait 34 years for answers. And finally, it's hard for the families of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski to wait for answers for 37 years last week. For many of us, words like closure and justice seem almost alien at this point. For my family, it seems all we are seeking is answers. To that end, I renew our call to FBI Norfolk and the Virginia State Police and all other law enforcement agencies involved in this case to redouble your efforts to solve it. We need your time, attention, and resources. Only through your continued hard work and dedication will we be able to have the answers we have been seeking for so long. Experts tell us that the Colonial Parkway murders is a solvable case. Let's make the loss of Keith, Sandy, Robin, David, Anna, Daniel, Kathy, and Becky, and the families who continue to wait a priority. My thanks to Ed Taylor of the Cumberland Historic Cemetery Organization and the members of the Call family for organizing this memorial tribute to Keith, and to all of you for showing that you care about Keith and all of the victims of the Colonial Parkway murders.
I was there listening to you say that. I feel like I was hearing those remarks again for the first time. Honestly, I don't know if it's because I was in a state of fear because I had to get up and speak after you or what. I don't know what it was, but I was listening to that and going, did he say that the first time around? And I realized, of course you must have. I know you did, but it's really lovely remarks.
Thank you. Tell us what you told us.
All right, here are mine. Good afternoon. My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm the co-host of the Mind Over Murder podcast, along with my partner, Bill Thomas. I'm also a victims advocate who's been involved with the Colonial Parkway murders cases since 2016. I'm honored to be able to speak to you today. Each week, as Bill and I do our research and reporting for the podcast, we find ourselves running into the term closure. It's a term that is kindly meant, often used after an arrest or once a case has been adjudicated, as in, what a relief, now these families have closure. Neither of us like that word. Both of us shy away from it in our reporting. That's because closure is a misnomer for the families of those who have been murdered or gone missing. When someone is deprived of the opportunity to say goodbye, to make amends, or to express their love a final time due to a sudden and traumatic loss, closure is an impossibility. For the Call and the Hailey families, and for all of those who loved Keith and Sandy, closure or anything close to it will never happen while these two young people remain missing and while their killer goes uncaught. As long as there is a hole in the world where a loved one should have been, there can be no closure. There can, however, be answers. There can be justice. Even after 3 decades, these things are possible. Forensic science and technology have advanced to a point that hardly seemed possible 37 years ago. Now, minuscule amounts of DNA can be tested and killers caught as a result. Cases older than this are being solved on a nearly daily basis. As law enforcement invests time, attention, and resources into their oldest, coldest cases, it is increasingly obvious that cases like the Colonial Parkway murders are solvable. This gives me hope that soon it will be our turn. Maybe today will be the day when answers are found. Maybe today will be the day when the road to justice extends before us. Until there are answers and until there is justice, memory and friendship and fellowship remain. I hope today is a day in which the memories of a life with Keith in it are a comfort and a solace to those who loved him. And I hope that this beautiful stone is a reminder of a life well lived, although it was a life cut all too short. Answers will come for Keith, Sandy, and all the victims in this case. Justice will come. I look forward to the day we can celebrate them together. Thank you.
Very nicely done.
I was about to say, this is the first time I've ever spoken at a memorial service. And then I just realized that I'm wrong, actually. I had to speak at a friend's memorial service in college. I have not enjoyed either task just because it's so tough to have to do it. It's so painful. But I felt like when all was said and done, even though it was a very emotionally upsetting day, I think that it went really well. And I think that we accomplished something, if only in making sure that there is a service that Keith's family can remember and a way in which we were able to say goodbye to him.
And I think one of the things that the placement of the stone in the family's burial plot there at the Rosewell Cemetary, it gives them a place to go. This is something that several of the Call family siblings mentioned was we never had a place to go to mark Keith's passing or pray for him or think about him. Now, obviously, you can do those things anywhere. You could kneel in your own backyard or go for a walk on the beach or go to one of Keith's favorite places. But I think for a lot of people, it's very helpful to have a place that you can go to mark the passage of time, the fact that you're still thinking about your loved ones, much in the same way you might go to Mr. and Mrs. Call's graves and place flowers on Mother's Day and Father's Day and at other times of the year. I think the wonderful offer from the Cumberland Historic Cemetery Organization allowed the Call family to have a place now that they can think of as Keith's. As we talked about before, we're hoping that at some point Keith and Sandy's remains will be located. However small they might be, that those remains would be placed, in Keith's example, at that cemetery plot. For the Haileys, at a place they might designate. If we accomplish nothing else, I think that was time well spent on a rainy Saturday in October.
Actually, I think if there's any cosmic indicator, that was time well spent. Do you want to tell our listeners what happened when you turned on your radio to go over to the church?
I think some people who listen to the podcast know that I worked in the music business for a lot of years. I knew that Keith was a big music fan, and there's this wonderful video, which we've seen, of Keith a few months before he died, waiting in line to see a then very popular rock band called U2, which is one of my favorites. I just thought it was so wonderful. I climbed into the car at the end of the ceremony, and I turned on my satellite radio to drive over to the church. And what was playing? A wonderful U2 song. And I thought, well, there's a nice little sign from Keith that everything's fine and that his favorite band is playing wherever he is.
No, I agree. I thought that was great. And then later on, after I was leaving the church service to drive back across the water, the exact same thing happened to me. Turn on the car radio, first song, Where the Streets Have No Name, U2. And I thought, wow.
Keith would love that.
If there is any sort of cosmic synchronicity out there, it was happening on that day. We did have listeners who showed up for this memorial, and really that means a lot to us. It means a lot to the Call family. It means a lot to us, and we can't thank you enough for those of you that took the time to come out. There was a listener there who shot video of the whole entire thing and put it up on YouTube. It is very meaningful that this has impacted the community the way that it has. So for those of our listeners who did show up on that day and you just took the time to say hello, thank you all so much. It is amazing that you're willing to show up for that, especially on a day like that. It was so rainy. We do have a link to the YouTube video of those remarks, and we will put that in our show notes. And of course, we will also link their photos from that day as well. Thank you all so much for listening and for taking the time to listen to us recount our remarks from that particular day. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.